My name is Della Ashworth, and I'm 34 years old. I can still pinpoint the exact second my life split into two completely different versions. The one where I kept absorbing it, and the one where I finally didn't. It was December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, and I was standing in my parents' kitchen in Denver, still wearing my coat from the drive over, when my father walked in with an expression I'd learned to dread since I was a little girl. Not anger. Something quieter and worse than anger. That slow, satisfied half smile that meant he'd already made a decision somewhere in his head and was only now getting around to informing me of it. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and said it like he was reading off a grocery list. Your brother's college buddies are coming for Christmas dinner this year. Maybe 30 people total. You'll handle the cooking and get everything set up. That was the entire announcement. No question mark anywhere in the sentence. No, would you mind? Just a statement delivered with the total confidence of a man who had never, not once in his life, heard the word no from a woman in his family. My brother Jonah was standing behind him in the doorway, and when I looked at him, hoping for even the smallest flicker of discomfort, some tiny sign that he understood how absurd this was, he just nodded along, like the whole thing had already been settled before I'd even walked through the door. Like I was already the staff. I stood there for a long moment, coat still zipped, bag still slung over my shoulder. 30 people. Christmas dinner. Less than 48 hours' notice. My father had said maybe 30 people, the exact way someone says, it's just one quick favour. When what they actually mean is it's your entire holiday, your rest, your time, your dignity, and none of those things matter as much as my convenience. I'd driven 3 hours from Boulder for what I genuinely believed would be a quiet family Christmas. I'd taken time off work for it. I'd bought gifts and wrapped every single one carefully, packed an overnight bag with the kind of stubborn hope you can never quite kill, no matter how many holidays this particular family has already ruined. And now they expected me to cook, clean, smile, and disappear into the role they'd assigned me before I'd even said hello. What neither of them knew, what nobody in that house had any idea about, was that exactly 2 weeks earlier, my co-worker Priya had mentioned, almost in passing, a ridiculous last-minute flight deal to Bali. I'd laughed it off at the time. I wasn't actually considering it. I'd looked it up purely out of curiosity, the way you glance at things you're fairly sure you'll never really do. But something in me had taken a screenshot anyway. Something in me had saved the airline's customer service number in my phone, just in case. And that night, standing in my parents' kitchen with my coat still on and my bag still on my shoulder, staring at my father's little smirk and my brother's silent nod, I felt something shift inside me. Like a door closing, very quietly, very permanently, somewhere deep in my chest. I smiled, not a big smile, just a small private one I kept mostly to myself. Okay, I said evenly. Let me go freshen up first. I went upstairs to the guest room, sat down on the edge of the bed and opened my phone. The flight was somehow still available. One seat left on a red-eye out of Denver at 11:50 that night, landing in Bali 2 days later, after a layover I barely registered. It cost significantly more than I'd have ever normally spent on anything for myself. I didn't hesitate for even a second. I booked it in under 5 minutes. Then I texted Priya, who had actually been to Bali before and knew exactly which area to recommend. She wrote back almost instantly with a hotel name, a nightly rate, and the words, "Finally, go do something just for you." I booked the hotel. 5 nights with a private pool villa, because at that point I figured if I was doing this, I was doing it properly. I sat on the edge of that guest bed, watching the confirmation emails land one after another in my inbox, and I felt something I genuinely hadn't felt in years. A relief so clean and so total, it almost physically hurt. I came back downstairs, bag still packed inside my coat, and told them I'd forgotten something important back at my apartment. and needed to quickly drive back to grab it, that I'd be back in a couple of hours. My father didn't even glance away from the television. Jonah was already buried in his phone. Neither of them questioned a single word of it, because it genuinely never crossed either of their minds that I might be lying, that the woman they'd spent 34 years quietly taking for granted might be standing in their living room for the very last time that holiday season. I drove to the airport in the kind of stillness that only arrives once a decision has been completely, fully made. No second guessing, no guilt spiralling in my head, no rehearsing apologies I didn't owe anyone. I parked, checked my bag, and sat at my gate eating an overpriced airport sandwich with a sparkling water. And I want to be honest with you, it might genuinely be one of the best meals I've ever had in my entire life. Not because of the sandwich, because of what that moment represented. I was sitting completely alone in a quiet terminal on Christmas Eve, totally unbothered, and the only thing I felt was something dangerously close to joy. My phone started buzzing around 9 that evening. I let it go to voicemail, then again, closer to 10. Then my mother called. Then Jonah called. Then a number I didn't recognise called twice, which I assumed was one of his college friends trying to figure out where exactly the food had disappeared to. I switched my phone to silent, zipped it into my bag, and watched the departures board until my gate finally got called. When my family arrived at the house Christmas morning and found a completely empty kitchen, I was somewhere over the Pacific, wrapped in a thin airline blanket, watching the sun rise through a tiny oval window. I heard later through my cousin Marlo, who heard it secondhand from an aunt, that when Jonah walked into that kitchen and saw absolutely nothing, not one pan on the stove, not a single dish started, his face went completely white. But the real surprise, for me at least, was still about 36 hours away. I landed in Bali 2 mornings later, and the first thing that hit me stepping off the plane was the warmth. Real, heavy, tropical air, completely different from any heat I'd ever felt back home. Not suffocating, gentle, almost, like the climate itself was personally welcoming me somewhere I actually belonged. I grabbed my bag, found my driver, and rode to the villa with my forehead resting against the window, watching rice terraces and palm trees blur past, thinking about absolutely nothing at all. That, it turned out, was the real gift I'd given myself without even realising it going in. Silence inside my own head. For the first time in years, there was no running mental checklist, no low-grade anxiety about what someone else needed from me next, no constant background hum of obligation that had quietly soundtracked my entire adult life up to that point. The villa itself was modest, but the view absolutely wasn't. I stood on the edge of that private pool for almost half an hour, just looking out at the rice fields stretching toward the horizon, this impossible layered green that no photograph back home would ever quite capture. I stood there until my legs got tired, then ordered food, ate it in my pyjamas by the water, and fell asleep mid-afternoon with the doors wide open and the sound of birds and distant gamelan music drifting in from somewhere down the hill. By the time I finally turned my phone's sound back on that evening, I had 34 missed calls. My father had called 8 times. Jonah, 11. My mother had left 5 voicemails, each one escalating in drama from the last. The first was simply confused. The second, irritated. The third was tearful in a way that somehow felt more performed than genuine. The fourth and fifth blended every emotion into one long, breathless message that ended with, "I genuinely don't know what's gotten into you, Della, but this is not how this family behaves toward one another." I listened to every single one of them sitting cross-legged on the villa bed with a glass of fresh mango juice in my hand, and when the last voicemail finally ended, I set the phone face down on the nightstand and didn't call anyone back. What I did instead was text my cousin Marlo, the only person in my entire extended family I actually fully trusted. Marlo was 26, sharp as anything, and had spent years quietly watching me absorb every unreasonable demand this family produced, without ever once complaining out loud. I sent her one photo of the rice terraces from my balcony and a single line, "I'm in Bali, Merry Christmas." She called me back within 30 seconds, laughing so hard she could barely get words out. She told me everything that had happened back at the house, how Jonah had called their aunt in a panic, asking if she could bring food last minute, how my father had ended up paying triple for emergency catering and had been furious about the bill the entire night, how two of Jonah's friends had left early because the whole evening felt tense and uncomfortable, and how my mother had actually cried at the dinner table. Not, Marlo was quick to clarify, because she missed me, but because the entire evening simply hadn't gone the way she'd pictured it in her head. I listened to all of it and felt nothing except a quiet, settled certainty that I had done exactly the right thing. On the second day, I hired a scooter and rode along the coastline until my arms ached from gripping the handlebars. On the third day, I joined a small snorkeling tour and floated above a coral reef for almost 2 hours, watching fish move through colours I genuinely didn't have names for. On the fourth day, I did absolutely nothing except lie by the pool and finally finish a novel I'd been carrying around half-read for nearly a year. I ate when I was hungry. I slept when I was tired. I didn't speak to a single person from back home. It was the most complete rest I think I'd ever experienced in my adult life, and somewhere in the middle of it, something clarified for me that I'd been circling for years without ever quite landing on directly. I'd been trained, since childhood, to believe that love in my family was fundamentally transactional, that my worth was tied directly to how useful I made myself, that if I cooked enough, cleaned enough, showed up enough, arranged enough, and quietly swallowed enough of my own needs, I would eventually be loved in return, like love was something you could finally earn enough credit toward. What 5 days alone on the other side of the world taught me was that I'd been paying into a system that was never, under any circumstances, going to pay me back. My father's smirk that night in the kitchen wasn't a one-time moment of thoughtlessness. It was simply the latest summary line in 34 years of a dynamic I had, this entire time, actually had the power to just stop participating in. When I flew home, I felt different in a way I couldn't fully articulate, but that was apparently obvious from the outside, because Priya told me later that the second I walked back into the office after the holidays, something about my whole face had changed. "Less braced," she said. "Like you finally stopped waiting for something to hit you." My father called once more in January. I picked up. He talked for several minutes about disappointment, about responsibility, about what family is supposed to mean to a person. I let him finish completely. Then I told him clearly and without a single shake in my voice that I would no longer be available to staff future family gatherings, that my time carried the exact same value as everyone else's in that family, and that if that was a difficult concept for him to accept, we could revisit the entire relationship on those terms going forward. He hung up. I set the phone down, made myself a cup of tea, and stood in my own kitchen, in my own apartment, in my own actual life. And I felt something that I'm fairly sure was the closest thing to real peace I'd ever experienced. I'd smiled, quietly, that night in their kitchen. They'd walked into an empty house the next morning. And somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, for the very first time in 34 years, I had finally seen myself clearly. If you've ever been the one expected to cook, clean, and disappear into the background of your own family's holiday, and you finally said no, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this one kept you here until the very last word, make sure you're subscribed, because next week I've got another one for you.